Now on BBC4, Robert McCrum, literary editor of The Observer, profiles a remarkable man and even more remarkable woman.
Ever since I arrived here as a young soldier at the end of the Second World War, this city has curiously haunted me. Whatever's happened in Trieste, however much it changes, however often I come here, for more than half a century, the feelings it stirs in me have remained the same. And in those moments of sudden stillness, I'm not simply revisiting the place, I'm re-examining myself too.
Jan Morris is a mystery, even to herself. First James, the family man and newspaper reporter. Then Jan, the famous writer and transsexual. She has crossed every kind of frontier with romantic courage, always writing with true grit and high glamour. Hers is an extraordinary life. Now, in her quest for meaning, she has returned to Trieste. For 50 years, the city has been a reflection of herself, a place in limbo, uncertain of its identity. At 75, Morris is still a conundrum, but now she's ready to answer some of the big questions about her life and work.
I'm homesick. I'm thinking sad thoughts about age, doubt, and disillusion. But I'm not unhappy. I feel there are good people around. And an unspecified yearning steals narcotically over me, what the Welsh call hiraeth.
Welsh for longing, Morris's hiraeth carried her to North Wales. She was actually born in Somerset, enjoyed an English public school education and went to Oxford. But it was in Wales as a man that she lived with her wife and 4 children. It's hard not to be fascinated by Jan Morris. First, there's the sex change. As well as the unusual life story, there is also a stream of books and articles driven by her need for a better understanding of her identity as a person and as a writer. Author of several contemporary classics, she's a one-off and an outsider. Would our meeting, I wondered, offer any clues to this unique life?
Hello, Robert.
Hi.
Come in. Nice to see you. Have a glass of wine.
Thank you very much. I deeply needed it.
Come in.
Jan, when did you first know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I suppose I began by writing poetry, like most people do, don't they? But then gradually I turned to prose and I found I liked writing essays. And that's what I've been doing ever since, really.
She can cut herself off entirely from the world while she is writing. And I haven't known her for one day, even in illness, not working. On Christmas Day, when I was a child, she'd be working, which is very boring for a lot of people. But I now admire it greatly.
Morris started as a reporter on The Times. Willing to go anywhere and to risk everything, he got his first big career break in 1952. In the Welsh hills, Edmund Hillary was training for Mount Everest. The Times had the exclusive. Morris, their man on the mountain, was about to get the scoop of a lifetime.
For me, it was an amazing experience because I was really so insufferably ambitious, as a matter of fact. And I wasn't terribly, not frightfully interested in the fact of climbing Everest. I'd never been interested before, you know, very much, any more than anybody else. And when I got onto this thing, I was thinking always of getting a scoop, as we used to say then, of beating the opposition and getting the news home. That was what interested me.
It's quite one thing, never having done this kind of thing before, for James Morris to get himself fit, go out with the expedition. become one of them. Tough lot of well-known, much experienced mountaineers. In the end, have the guts and ability to go very high up onto Camp 5, but all the time recognizing that all this is nothing if I can't get the results of the expedition back home.
For Morris, Everest was about journalism first and adventure second. The expedition had to succeed as a story. Somehow, the Times had to break the news. The romance of Everest had captured Morris's imagination. Now he had to outwit his rivals.
I knew that if I gave it to the Indians in clear, that it would no longer be private to me. They would instantly sell the news. Of course, it was quite a commercial commodity then. So I thought, and if I sent it in a code, they wouldn't send it for me. So I devised a code which appeared not to be in a code, if you follow me. It made perfect sense, but it happened to be the wrong sense. And with that, armed with that, I got them to send it to Kathmandu for me. And of course it was intercepted or was spread elsewhere, and indeed some papers published the news that it had failed.
It was, of course, a triumph. Hillary and Tenzing climbed to the top of the world at the end of May. Morris reached his own summit when the Times printed his story on June the 2nd, 1953.
And it got back to London on Coronation Day, and one can't, as a friend, help feeling vaguely part of this amazing story.
This was the dawn of a new era. This was going to be the second Elizabethan age. And book after book, celebrated all the great things happening. Everything seemed to fit into place. Stanley Matthews winning the cup final, England winning the Ashes at cricket, there was an air race to Australia, there were athletic achievements and so on. And Everest was very, very much part of this. The conquest of Everest was an enormous thing. It might even go down, I think, as perhaps the last great achievement of empire.
Everest was as big as the coronation. It made Morris famous around the world. In a new era, he was a new voice. He quickly established a reputation for colourful international reportage with a uniquely personal accent.
This is Tokyo, one of the biggest and busiest and most unusual of the world's capitals. It's big because 8 million people live in it. It's busy because it's the capital of Japan, a great industrial power, where they make anything from artificial pearls to ocean liners.
But journalism couldn't satisfy a romantic writer like Morris. He was already beginning the transition to a new kind of writing and a new kind of identity.
I grew a bit tired of the world. That's why I left journalism. That I'd had a grandstand view of great events, and they soured on me, as a matter of fact. And they've remained sour on me, to tell you the truth.
This was the decade of the Cold War. So anybody traveling the world as a journalist was necessarily being forced into a confrontation with this black and white situation of the Cold War. Morris was not interested in the Cold War. I think from the beginning there was an element of romanticism. It was the good things, the upbeat things, the positive things that he wanted to celebrate in his writing.
I don't want to find out anything bad about anybody. I just want to find them nice and happy and friendly. And by and large they are.
In 1960, Morris published Venice, the book for which he remains most famous. La Serenissima, strange, remote, romantic, and threatened by nature, was the perfect subject for Morris. In her own words, an air of flags and freedom pervades Venice on such mornings, and all feels light, spacious, carefree, crystalline, as though the decorators of the city had mixed their paints in champagne.
It was the best thing that ever happened to me in life. Because Venice was just at the end of the war. Venice was in a melancholic, a romantic condition. It was like a surrendered knight at arms, I thought. And it left it would leave on anybody a permanent effect. The whole sense of the city, the sadness of it, the beauty of it, the fascination, the fun of it all stuck bonk, went into my mind, and I've never got rid of it from that day to this. So when it came to the time to think about writing books, bigger books, Venice was a fairly obvious choice for a first subject.
Venice is the work of a passionate enthusiast that has shaped British travel journalism ever since. Morris's essay of imagination steered her writing into new, deeper and more complex waters.
Before that time, travel writers were either greatly influenced by their classical education, the public schools and universities, and they wrote in a Robert Byron form, the Road to Oxiana, books which were, heavily dependent on scholarship and were clearly not for the general reader. You had to have done a degree in greats, to be able to follow those books. Or there was the angry book, in the Evelyn Waugh tradition of the English travel report, who was always complaining about how bad the waiters were, how dirty the streets were, and so on. The Graham Greene kind of travel writing.
Whatever the genre, whether it's history or travel writing or autobiography, have been concerned with place, but they're not concerned with travel, and they're not designed, intended to tell readers what they will find in a place. They're only saying what a place has done to me. I don't think of myself as a travel writer. It's a label I don't at all like, as a matter of fact.
Travel writing had a very stuffy image. It was quite fossilised. After its heyday in the 30s, when it flourished, it became moribund for a while. And I think that it was associated with the past, and it was considered a lesser genre, and a travel writer was a lesser kind of writer. But I think those of us who followed in Jan's footsteps don't feel that, in no small measure, due to people like her blazing a trail and making it an acceptable genre.
The globe-trotting travel writer had reported on Britain's waning power. Now, as a maverick historian, she embarked upon her own account of the empire. Like all her work, the Pax Britannica trilogy was directly inspired by her own nomadic encounters.
I was travelling with the Sultan of Oman in some comfort, with slaves in trucks, and I wrote a book about it called Sultan in Oman, which I liked. It's still in print, as a matter of fact. And one critic said that it seemed to him that it was a waste of my talents writing about this fringe of the imperial story, and that I ought to get down to doing something bigger about it. And that critics do sometimes have an effect, don't they? And that had an effect on me. And I thought perhaps it was a bit of a fiddly way of looking at a subject that interested me, and so I thought I'd do a book, first of all, about the climax of empire. In 1897 I took it to be the Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and then later I went backwards, further back into the 19th century, and I came up to the end, which I took to be Churchill's funeral.
Pax Britannica was the centrepiece of her literary career. A mixture of reportage and requiem, the trilogy was a 10-year project, a triumphant record of Morris's curiosity about the grandeur of empire. It was more a celebration of Queen Victoria's heyday than a critique. In her own words, this imperial elite was, as conquerors go, well behaved. Its values were solid, its rulers were mostly sensible, corruption was rare.
I think her personal curiosity and enthusiasm does very much condition what she's writing about. So in Pax Britannica, I don't think it's bad history, in the sense I don't think it is misleading you about what was achieved. But again, I think it often plays down some of the nastiest bits of the British Empire.
We're not qualified to judge the emotions and the motives of the past. And I'm an onlooker, an outsider always in life, and a reporter too. And so I reported what I felt about it, what I saw, but I didn't say how wicked they were to do this thing. Occasionally I said how good they were to do it. But
Have you got into trouble for that?
Yeah, a little bit, of course. Yes. Odd enough, not from the subject nations, but from liberals in Britain.
All the negative aspects of empire are there. But Morris is choosing not to dwell on those, but to go beyond them, to celebrate the energies of all the people involved. And I think that is a perspective which you don't get from other histories. Historians might deal, with the politics and with the detail of empire, but they miss that sense of adventure.
Obviously, what attracted me about Venice was also what attracted me about the empire in many ways, but both of them had been very, very, very splendid, and both of them were greatly diminished by my time. And so both the books express the same sort of attitude to history. And they're both as much history books, really, or they don't look like it, as they are any other sort of book.
But now it was time for Morris to address her own personal history. Wherever her writing takes her, Wales has been her adopted home since the 1960s. It's also her subject and inspiration. I sense these deep roots have given her the strength to face the truth about her divided nature.
I'm a hybrid in all ways, as you've already detected, And I've always liked the softer side of me better than the harder side of me. And the soft side fitted better into the Welsh way of life than it fitted into the English way of life. I felt I couldn't live away from it, really, and I thought this was the one place where I had to put down roots. I've lived here an awfully long time. I brought up my children here who are extremely Welsh in every way. But I suppose in the sense that I'm an outsider everywhere, I feel it here, but less here than anywhere else.
Morris became the supreme outsider when she became one of Britain's first transsexuals. I swallowed, she writes, at least 12,000 pills of female matter, changing me from man to hermaphrodite. I felt like a slow-motion Jekyll and Hyde. In 1972, Morris went to Casablanca and made the transition from James to Jan. She broke the news in a book. Conundrum was both honest yet romantic. Morris had the world's top story. This time she was her own scoop.
I thought it was necessary that I should write it so that everybody would know what had happened, And so I did it as I would write a letter to somebody, really.
After Conundrum was published, I think there was a public reaction among some members of our society of repugnance, perhaps even of resentment, of a feeling, one doesn't do that. One accepts the body into which one was born.
I've said what a horrible condition it was, and I've said what a marvellous fulfilment it is.
Jan, you mentioned God. Now, some people watching, believing in God, might be saying to themselves, well, that was God's will, and you've somehow frustrated God's will.
On the contrary, I've interpreted this thing romantically, coyly and tweely, as some sort of a quest that has been imposed upon me. I don't say that everybody who's in this condition can possibly feel that thing, or should, or that it is necessarily so. I just feel that it is, in my case, it's a book about it's an arrogant book, an egotistical book about myself, and I'm afraid that you must take it or leave it.
I have a letter, the longest letter I ever had, in which she says, very modestly, I do feel I've achieved a kind of at-one-ment, the word atonement, at-one-ment. And I'm not sure where my life now direct me next, and what difference it will make to my writing. We shall have to wait and see, exclamation mark.
I think the view that Jan Morris is a slightly different writer than James Morris is a valid one. There is an edge in the earlier writing, and this personal voice, of addressing the reader, is a slight softening as well. That the judgment of the historian has given way to a slightly more conversational tone.
I think the evolution of Jan's style is simply a reflection of her finding her voice, and that's what happens to most writers, certainly most good ones. There aren't very many writers you can take a book that they wrote in 1957 and compare it with one they wrote in 2002 and say, well, there's no change of style here.
I would say that the main difference in her writing is that she's happier, and so is more free to enjoy the world than maybe she was before.
I was going to say that the books are happier than they used to be, but in fact the happiest book I've ever written was the one about Venice, which was done before all this happened, and which breathes the spirit of young happiness, I think. But the thing is, despite this problem, this worrying thing, this nagging conundrum, I have actually been very happy. I've been very fortunate in all other aspects of life, and I managed to put aside the part that was so distressing and got on with the other happy part of it.
Morris's family is one of the happy parts. She still lives with Elizabeth, the mother of their 4 children.
Fragile, open gently. Is it anthrax?
In Conundrum, Morris writes, "Though Elizabeth and I are divorced, we are locked in our friendship more absolutely than ever, and propose to share our lives happily ever after. And connecting us too with our children is a dear bond we cannot break."
For me, it remains a mystery, and I always thought of it from the beginning as a much more spiritual and a physical thing, and I still feel that so too.
What did you say about your book?
I always thought, as a matter of fact, I'd wasted this experience, or perhaps I'm not competent to use the experience properly, because, you know, it's a big thing, isn't it, to move from one half of mankind to the other half, and a bigger writer than me, I think, would probably have done something with it, but just what? I don't know, and I sometimes think maybe that's what I'm still left in life to do. But I think perhaps I'm not a big enough writer to tackle such a theme as that. And who is? I don't know.
The sex change resolved Morris's questions about her identity, but her writing still defied classification. Her one novel, The Last Letters from Havre, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, was written as a kind of spoof travel book.
Well, this was intended to be an allegory of the world itself. Quite an imposing ambition, really, and how muddled I was by it all. But nobody recognized it was an allegory, although I made it perfectly obvious, I should have thought. I made the symbol of the city a maze, for example. In every way, I kept rubbing in the allegorical bit, and nobody noticed, except I only had one letter from one reader commenting me upon the allegory, and that was an octogenarian lady in Iowa. There weren't enough of them, I can assure you.
You might say it was a new departure in that it is a novel, but it's not really so different to her writing about places. In fact, it is a kind of a composite of all sorts of things that she's seen and experienced. And so it is a novel, but you couldn't say really that it has a plot like Graham Greene or something, can you? So I'm not sure it is so different to her writing before, as a matter of fact.
But I've seen it as that she's been able to express herself in all the ways that she wants to through non-fiction, because she has such a flexible attitude to the genre, and in her hands it becomes so malleable. Books that are a bit of this, bit of that, a bit of the other, and that was Jan's territory, really. And she was a pioneer of writers who were able to stray beyond their genre.
Morris's writing continues to resist neat summary, like its author. For her latest book, The Meaning of Nowhere, she has returned to Trieste, the city of exiles, a subtle piece of autobiography in which Morris links herself to a divided city.
You know how it is, one doesn't realize what one's writing all the time. But I think it is perfectly true that that I was subconsciously exploring my nature. Perhaps all writers are, whatever they write, but perhaps more so with me, because nature is a more complex and far peculiar one than most. But it's true, and it's also true that it's gone on through my career until the last book of all, which I've written now about Trieste, is more self-indulgent than all the others. It's the one that gets closest to revealing what I feel about myself. But people sometimes don't recognize that. They just read it as another damn travel book. For me, Trieste is an allegory of limbo. My acquaintance with the city spans the whole of my adult life. But like my life, it still gives me a waiting feeling, as if something big but unspecified is always about to happen. And outsider that I am, I see myself as part of this half-real, half-imagined seaport. So that now, after all these years, I've written a book about Trieste, my last book too. It's bound to be a work partly of civic impressionism, but partly of introspection or self-indulgence. I've always thought of myself as an outsider, you know, and I've written as an outsider always. I've never pretended to get inside the spirits or the thoughts of other cultures, other peoples, other cities even. I'm always the onlooker. I've never pretended to be anything else.
The full title of the book is Trieste and the Meaning of Nowhere, because ultimately Morris realizes that, you know, the melancholy is all, that the things have passed in that way, and we keep going back to John Ellerton's hymn, you know, so be it, Lord, thy throne shall never, like earth's proud empires, pass away. The theatres close, the curtain falls, the armies go home, the battles are over, and it all crumbles to dust in the end.
All my life I've been concerned with things that are fading, really. So in that way, the melancholic streak has been important, I think, to my craft.
She said, doesn't she, that The Meaning of Nowhere is her last book. But in my conversations with her since then, the exact meaning of book has become slightly nebulous, so that it doesn't mean she's not going to write anymore. But it might mean the last of that kind of a book.
I've had enough of the whole publishing business, but I haven't said that I'm not going to write. In fact, my romantic scheme is to write something exquisite, which I'm going to pluck out of the sky and write, and I'm going to finish it and plunk it under the stairs with the other junk up there, so that my great-grandchildren can find it one day and flog it for $1 million to Random House.
Morris is still exploring what she calls the mystery of myself. To the public, she is a sexual pioneer. Widely read in the English-speaking world, she is also known as an important contemporary writer of unique honesty and courage, generous of spirit and instinctively optimistic. Morris has trod an unusual path from journalism to fiction in search of answers. Now in retirement, I think she's reached a kind of reconciliation with herself. Here in Wales, she seems happy to contemplate eternity on the banks of the river of time.
As for me, when my clock moves on for the last time, I shall happily haunt the two places that have most happily haunted me. Most of the after time, I shall be wandering with my beloved along the banks of the Dwyfor in Wales. But now and then, you may find me here, below the walls of Miramare, watching the nightingales swarm. I write of exiles in Trieste, but I've generally felt myself an exile too. For years I felt myself an exile from normality, and now I feel myself an exile from time. The past is a foreign country, but so is old age, and as you enter it, you feel you're treading unknown territory, leaving your own land behind. This kind of exile can mean a new freedom too, because most things don't matter as they used to. The way I look doesn't matter. The opinions I cherish are entirely my own business. The books I've written are no more than smudged graffiti on a wall, and I shall write no more of them. Money? Enough to live on, I hope. Critics? To hell with them. Kindness is what matters. All along, at any age. Kindness, the ruling principle of nowhere.
Barry Stevens believes he has hundreds of half-brothers and sisters, courtesy of his sperm.